On March 12, 1981, a little before 9 in the evening, a man stepped into the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., with a briefcase that would pull his whole life apart. His name was Richard Coleman. He was 44, and that briefcase held printed photos of classified papers, coded notes written in Russian, and a list of names written in his wife's hand. When he walked out of that building 3 hours later, federal agents had already begun treating his wife as a possible Soviet asset, and his 3 kids were about to be folded into one of the most complicated cover stories the Cold War ever produced. The Coleman family lived in Arlington, Virginia, about a 20-minute drive from downtown Washington. Their house was a simple 2-story colonial on a quiet street where neighbors recognized each other, kids rode bikes until the streetlights snapped on, and nothing ever seemed unusual. Richard worked as a mid-level analyst at the Department of Commerce, a job he had settled into back in 1973. Margaret worked there too, 3 days a week, as an administrative assistant in the Office of Trade Policy. She had dropped from full-time to part-time after their first child was born in 1968. On her days off, Tuesday and Thursday, she taught piano lessons at home, lining up students through the afternoon while their children, Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah, were away at school. Neighbors interviewed long after the fact remembered them as a standard suburban family trying to juggle work, routines, and the slow pace of early Reagan-era life. 2 incomes, steady schedules, nothing that stood out. But on January 28, 1981, the surface started to split. Richard came home early that day, around 2:30, saying he felt like he was coming down with the flu. Margaret was upstairs, and when she heard his car pull in, she hurried down with a speed that he later described as off, too quick, her face red and her nerves showing in a way he hadn't seen before. He let it go. He went to lie down in the guest room and assumed he would forget the whole moment by morning. He might have, too, if not for what he found the next day. In the back of their bedroom closet sat a floorboard that had never rested quite right. Richard had planned to fix it for months, but never had. On the morning of January 29th, he noticed the board was sticking up farther than usual. When he pulled it free, he uncovered a small metal box, roughly 8 inches by 6 inches. Inside that plain box sat evidence that his wife had been passing information to the Soviets. Every item in the box was later recorded in careful detail in Richard's statements to federal investigators. There were 23 photographs of official-looking documents, all taken in dim light with a 35mm camera. Some of the pages were ones he recognized from his own office: trade reports, assessments, analysis summaries. Others clearly came from different sections within Commerce. And that mix, spread across those photos and the other items in the box, was enough to turn a quiet household in Arlington into the center of a federal case that would reshape all of their lives. Documents Margaret could reach through her routine administrative duties, along with memoranda and briefing papers that passed across her desk for filing or distribution, formed the first layer of what Richard uncovered. Among them were 4 letters written in coded Russian, later translated and shown to contain blunt instructions on dead drops and simple rules for covert communication. There were also receipts from a photo shop in Georgetown, all dated between May of 1980 and January of 1981. And there was a small notebook, roughly 3 by 5 inches, packed with tight columns of numbers and short abbreviations that cryptographers later identified as a straightforward substitution system. Richard never confronted his wife. Instead, he spent the next 6 weeks running what was, in effect, his own quiet surveillance effort. The steady, almost clinical way he approached it, later laid out in his sworn statement to federal agents, showed a man who knew he needed solid, undeniable proof before he could take the wrenching step of turning in his own spouse. His first move was simple. He photographed every single item inside the metal box. He used his own 35mm Canon AE-1, the same camera he usually brought out on vacations and birthdays, and he shot 2 full rolls of film, making sure he captured each page, every scribble, every mark that might matter later. He took the film to a photo shop Margaret had never used, a place in Silver Spring, and paid in cash while giving a false name. When he returned 3 days later to pick up the prints, he hid them in a locked drawer in his Commerce Department office,
a spot Margaret had no reason to open. After that, he began checking the box on a steady schedule, building a routine that let him see any changes while keeping Margaret unaware. According to his later testimony, he checked it on February 3rd, 7th, 11th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and March 2nd. Each visit, he noted whether anything had shifted, whether something new appeared, or whether older items had quietly vanished. On February 7th, 3 new photographs showed up. They looked like internal Commerce Department memos dealing with grain export policies to Eastern Europe. One of them was a report Richard himself had written, a document he had brought home to review over a weekend 2 weeks earlier. Realizing Margaret had photographed papers from his own briefcase, papers he had left on his home office desk without a second thought, made him sick. By February 19th, the notebook held 2 fresh pages of coded entries.
On March 2nd, one of the original letters had disappeared, and a new letter, written in a different hand, had taken its place. Richard kept track of everything. He filled a small notebook he stored in his car with dates, times, and short notes. He wrote down when Margaret left the house and when she returned. He began seeing patterns in her routines, small habits he had never noticed in all their years together, but that now stood out sharply. She always checked the mailbox before he got home from work, and once he started paying attention, the act looked less like a casual errand and more like a step in a process he still struggled to accept. She paused by the street a bit longer than made sense, like she was checking for something she didn't want him to notice. Back inside, she kept making short calls from the kitchen phone, the kind that stopped the second he stepped into the room. Over time, she built a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, always on her days off, always between 7:15 and 8:45 p.m., she'd say she needed to run to the grocery store or the pharmacy or spend a moment with her friend Patricia. It all sounded ordinary, but when Richard finally started trailing her, he saw that almost none of those errands led where she claimed. On February the 2nd, a Tuesday, Margaret walked out the door at 7:23 p.m. Richard counted to 3 minutes, then followed her in his car, staying far enough back that she wouldn't catch the glow of his headlights. Instead of heading toward the grocery store, she drove to PTOAC Park, roughly 4 miles from their place. She parked near the entrance and went straight to a particular bench that faced the water. She stayed there exactly 20 minutes. She didn't meet anyone, didn't signal anyone, didn't do anything strange on the surface. She flipped through a book now and then or just sat still, staring at the water as if she needed the quiet more than anything else. At 8:02 p.m., she stood up, walked back to her car, and drove to a 7-Eleven. She bought milk and bread, creating a clean, simple explanation for why she'd been gone. Richard saw the same sequence again and again throughout February. Every time it was a Tuesday or Thursday evening, the same park, the same green bench, the same precise 20 minutes. Soon Richard began arriving before she did. He'd pick a spot far enough away that she wouldn't notice him, but close enough to watch her carefully. He kept waiting to see another person approach her or some kind of exchange, but nothing ever happened. She always sat on that green bench with the dedication plaque. She always set her purse on the left side, never on her lap, never to the right. The routine was so exact it felt deliberate. On February 26th, Richard reached the park a full 2 hours before Margaret normally showed up. He settled about 50 yards back with binoculars he'd borrowed from a coworker, telling the coworker he wanted to try bird watching. At 7:04 p.m., a man came toward the bench Margaret always used. He looked around 45, wore a dark coat and a hat, and sat for less than 3 minutes. He opened a newspaper, glanced through it, then folded it neatly and left it on the bench before walking off. The newspaper stayed there for about 10 minutes until a jogger slowed down, sat for a moment, picked up the paper, and jogged away with it. When Margaret arrived at 7:27 p.m., the bench was empty again, as if nothing had happened. She sat in her usual spot, put her purse on the left side as always, and stayed the usual 20 minutes. When she got up to leave, Richard noticed the purse looked a bit less full than when she'd first sat down, though from that distance he couldn't be completely sure. He knew one thing for sure. He had just seen what looked like a textbook dead drop, the same kind of secret exchange he had heard about back when he went through security briefings at the Commerce Department. That thought stayed with him and pushed him to widen his search. He did not limit himself to watching from a distance anymore. He started paying closer attention to how Margaret moved through her days at home, trying to notice anything he might have brushed aside before. She often stayed up later than he did, saying she needed to finish a book or prepare lessons for the next day's students. It sounded normal, but now every small detail felt loaded. On the night of March 3rd, he let himself sink into the couch and pretended to drift off while the television played in the background. Through half-closed eyes, he watched Margaret come downstairs at 11:47 p.m. She paused, checked that he was asleep, and then slipped into the kitchen. A moment later, he heard the basement door open, then close again. When she finally returned upstairs, he counted 15 slow minutes before heading down himself. The basement was bare and unfinished, mostly storage shelves, old boxes, the washer and the dryer. He moved carefully, scanning every corner. He shifted cartons, pushed aside a crate of tangled extension cords, and checked behind the water heater. Nothing looked unusual at first. Then, behind a row of dusty paint cans stacked in the far corner, he spotted a small canvas bag, the type someone might use for gym clothes or a quick trip. His stomach tightened. He opened it with a flashlight in hand. Inside, he found things that made his fingers tremble. A second set of identification documents with Margaret's photo but another name, Elaine Warner, with an address in Baltimore. A roadmap of the greater Washington area with several spots circled in pencil. $500 in small bills, all 20s and 10s, and a slim pocket calendar with dates marked, every one matching the Tuesday and Thursday nights she had been leaving the house. He photographed each item, put everything back exactly the way it had been arranged, and climbed upstairs again. He never slept. He sat in the dark living room, listening to the quiet house, thinking about the woman he had lived beside for 16 years. He tried to sort out what had been real and what might have been constructed for reasons he had never guessed. He remembered how they met in 1965, two young employees at Commerce, how he had been pulled in by her sharp mind and her love of music. Now he wondered if she had been assigned to him from the start, if their relationship had been shaped by handlers, or if she had joined that world later and simply used the marriage once it already existed. He thought about their wedding. He thought about the birth of their children. He thought about plain evenings, grocery shopping, folding laundry, arguing over who should take out the trash. Ordinary moments now felt like scenes from a life built on sand. And he kept thinking about his briefcase sitting in his home office all those years, left unguarded after he went to bed, never once imagining that his own wife was opening it the moment he closed his eyes. He kept turning over the same question, wondering if any part of their life together had ever held the same weight for Margaret as it had for him, or if she had only treated him as a convenient figure in her hidden world, the man who carried the right clearances and far too much trust. By March 10th, Richard had gathered what he felt was enough material to hand over to federal officials. He had photos showing everything stored in the metal box. He had a detailed log of her movements, built from long evenings of quiet surveillance. He had more photos of the things buried in the basement. He had dates spelled out, places noted, times written down. What he lacked
and what kept him awake until dawn was any idea of how to shield Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah from the disaster he knew was coming. He sat for long stretches in his car during lunch, parked in random lots around Washington, trying to work through the impossible math of his choices. If he turned Margaret in, she would face arrest and an espionage charge. None of it would stay private. Reporters would swarm, the hearings would be open, and his children would suddenly be known at school and in their neighborhood as the kids whose mother had spied for the Soviets. They would face questions from adults, whispers from classmates, and maybe even suspicion from investigators who might wonder whether the children knew more than they should. They would grow up with that stain hanging over them, tied to a crime they never touched, carrying a judgment they could not escape. But if he kept quiet, then he stepped directly into her world of secrets.
He would, in practice, become part of her operation, an accessory who allowed classified information to keep flowing to the Soviets because he valued his children's comfort more than his responsibility to his country. Both paths looked ruinous, and neither offered a way to keep his family whole. In the end, the choice he made was to try both at once. He would go to the FBI and report Margaret, and at the same time build a careful lie that might shield the children from the real reason she vanished from their home. He would surrender his wife to federal agents, but he would not let Jennifer, Michael, or Sarah know what had taken her away. The idea took shape in the first week of March, growing through nights of little sleep and long hours of replaying every possible outcome. He went to the library and studied medical guides, learning just enough terms to make a story about cancer sound believable. He picked a made-up treatment center in upstate New York, far enough to discourage visits but close enough to sound reasonable. He rehearsed explanations for the questions he knew were coming about recovery, side effects, and how long their mother might be gone. On March 11th, Richard finally decided he would walk into the FBI office the next evening. He moved through his workday in a haze, barely able to keep his mind on anything, knowing he was about to change the future for all of them in a way he could never undo. That night, he went home and sat at the table with Margaret and the children for a plain midweek meal, spaghetti, garlic bread, and salad, trying to keep his face steady while his world edged toward collapse. Jennifer went on about a test she had taken at school, trying to explain every little part of it as if she was still sitting at her desk with the paper in front of her. Michael jumped in with his own story, talking fast about a science project he wanted to build with potato batteries and how he thought it might actually power a tiny bulb if he arranged everything the right way. Then Sarah leaned toward Margaret and asked if she could stay over at her friend Amanda's place on Friday night, saying it like it was already settled as long as she got a yes. Margaret laughed at something Michael had blurted out, reached over to clean a smear of sauce from Sarah's chin, and then glanced at Richard. She asked if he was feeling okay because he hadn't said much. Richard told her he was fine, only worn out from work, and he tried to hold that calm expression even though his stomach felt tight. He sat there knowing none of them had the faintest idea that this was their last ordinary dinner, the last time the five of them would sit around that table thinking life would go on the way it always had. He knew that within the next 24 hours, everything would tilt. He also knew his kids would spend years, maybe even decades, trying to understand the choice he was about to make. But the decision was already made in his mind.
And on March 12, 1981, he walked through the doors of the J. Edgar Hoover Building and started a process that would tear apart the life he had built, even though he believed it was the only way to save himself, and in a strange way, them too. During the 6 weeks leading up to that day, Richard struggled with one question, and as he later explained to federal investigators,
it was never about whether to report what he had found. It was about how to do it without crushing his 3 kids. Jennifer was 13, Michael was 11, and Sarah was 8. They had no clue their mother had been living a double life for years. Richard kept turning over the problem in his mind, trying to figure out how you tell 3 children, kids who were still in elementary and middle school, that their own mother was a Soviet spy without breaking something inside them that could never be repaired. The answer he finally settled on, the plan he carried into the FBI that day, was harsh in its own way, but felt to him like the least damaging option. He would tell them their mother had cancer. Special Agent David Thornton, the investigator who handled Richard's first statement, later wrote about that meeting in a declassified memo. Richard showed up at 8:47 p.m., then sat for 47 minutes before he managed to step up to the front desk. After that, he spent roughly 3 hours explaining everything he had uncovered. Thornton's notes said Richard stayed steady, organized, almost clinical, and he kept repeating 2 things. First, his wife needed to be arrested without delay. Second, his kids could not learn the truth about why the FBI had been digging into a leak inside the Commerce Department since late 1980. Sensitive documents tied to international trade policy and assessments of strategic resources had started appearing in Soviet intelligence briefings, which meant someone with access was feeding information to Moscow. Investigators still hadn't pinned down who was behind it. Then came Richard, with evidence that spelled it all out. He gave them a name, a system, a trail that went back at least to 1977 based on the earliest dates in the files he had recovered. Thornton noted in his report that the case was especially damaging because Margaret had 2 clear paths to classified material. She had her own administrative job, which allowed her to see a wide range of internal communications and policy drafts. And she also had access to the papers her husband brought home from his office, the ones he sometimes left on his desk or stacked in his study without thinking twice. She had long used both her job and her marriage to squeeze out every bit of intelligence she could pass along, pushing each advantage as far as it would go. But Richard's request about his children brought what Thornton later described as a strange mix of moral and practical trouble.
The Bureau normally stayed out of anything to do with how a suspect's family learned about an arrest. That was personal business. Yet here, Richard wanted active help in keeping a story alive. He planned to tell his children that their mother had been diagnosed with cancer, that she had to leave for treatment, that the outlook was uncertain. He asked the FBI to set up a final visit that looked like a simple trip to a hospital room. He wanted Margaret taken in without noise, without reporters, without any public record, until the illness story was solid in the children's minds. The request moved through the chain of command. Declassified memos show there was heavy debate inside the FBI about whether helping with a lie like this was acceptable or even lawful. Some argued that the Bureau had no place shaping a family's grief. Others thought refusing would punish the children more than anyone else. In the end, leadership agreed to follow Richard's plan. Part of the reasoning came from sympathy for the kids, and part from the simple fact that a silent arrest also protected the Bureau's interests. A quiet approach lowered the risk that other possible Soviet contacts tied to Margaret's circle would notice anything. Margaret Coleman was arrested at 6:47 a.m. on March 14, 1981, a Saturday morning. Federal agents served an arrest warrant based on a sealed complaint prepared the night before. 2 agents stepped through the front door Richard had left unlocked and detained her in the kitchen while she was making coffee. The report states she showed no resistance, did not ask for a lawyer, and only looked at Richard and said, "You found it." The children slept upstairs, unaware of anything. That afternoon, Richard brought Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah into the living room and told them their mother was sick. He used the word cancer, said it was serious, said she needed treatment in another state. Jennifer later recalled how her father laid out details with calm precision, the type of cancer, the treatment plan, the limits on visiting. He even had medical pamphlets from the library. He said their mother wanted to spare them from seeing her during harsh treatments. The children accepted it. Their father was not someone who exaggerated or played with emotions. If he said she was sick, then she was sick. There was no reason for them to doubt him. 2 days later, on March 16, 1981, Margaret was granted a supervised visit with the children at a secure federal site in Northern Virginia. The children were told they were going to see their mother at the hospital. They walked into a plain room with folding chairs and bright fluorescent lights, and Margaret was already inside. And as the supervising agent later wrote, she spent a long moment with each child, holding them close and telling them to stay strong, to look out for their father, and to keep in mind that she loved them more than anything.
The meeting ran for roughly half an hour, and it became the final moment Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah would share with their mother for 14 years. Margaret Coleman's guilty plea hearing opened on August 3, 1981, in federal court, handled there because so much of the evidence was classified. The process followed the Classified Information Procedures Act, which meant certain parts were sealed and only limited details were available to the public. She admitted guilt to 3 charges: conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession and transmission of national defense material, and acting as an undeclared agent for a foreign government without notifying the Attorney General. The prosecution laid out its case through court filings, showing that Margaret had been drawn into covert work in 1974 by a woman named Elena Rostova. Elena had posed as another piano instructor, someone friendly and harmless, while in reality she served as a Soviet intelligence officer working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. The approach had been slow. At first, the requests were small, basic facts anyone could find, harmless documents, casual opinions about people in the Commerce Department that felt more like idle conversation than anything illegal. By 1977, based on Margaret's own statements in court, she had begun photographing classified pages several times a month. She relied on her administrative role to copy whatever crossed her desk, and she added more by slipping items from Richard's briefcase when he brought his workload home. Most nights she waited until Richard was asleep, then used the small camera Elena had given her to record everything she could reach. She explained that she never received direct cash payments. Instead, her children's piano lessons were quietly covered, and her husband's car was unexpectedly repaired after a sudden breakdown. Small favors that looked like coincidences to anyone outside the situation, but were in fact calculated rewards meant to keep her tied to the work. When the judge asked why she had agreed to any of it, her reply, kept in the official transcript, was short. She said she had convinced herself early on that she was helping promote peace and mutual understanding between countries. She said that when she finally realized she was being used for espionage rather than anything diplomatic, she had already been warned that trying to back out would put her family in danger. She added that fear held her in place for years and made her continue long after she wanted it to end. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison, and she was moved to a women's correctional facility within a week. Meanwhile, in Arlington, Richard Coleman was carrying out the second part of his own plan, keeping everyone around him convinced that Margaret was still alive and undergoing long-term treatment.
He told neighbors she was staying in a specialized care center that restricted all visitors because her immune system was too weak, and people accepted the explanation without questioning it. He told the kids' teachers that their mother was in some experimental program and would be gone a long while, so they should expect the children to act a little different and try to be patient. He kept Margaret's piano right where it had always been, in the living room, as if moving it would admit something he wasn't ready to face. He filled the house with framed pictures of her, putting them on shelves, desks, and hallway tables. And he kept talking about her like she might walk through the door any day, once the doctors finally figured things out. The children adjusted in the uneven way kids usually do. Jennifer buried herself in schoolwork until it became her whole world. She pushed for every leadership role she could, ended up president of the student council, and kept a perfect record in her classes all the way through high school. Michael drifted toward taking apart anything he could get his hands on. First little gadgets, then radios, then bicycles, and later whole computer towers spread across the garage floor. Sarah, the youngest, pulled inward. She spoke less, watched more, and carried herself with a seriousness adults kept noticing, saying she seemed older than her age. Richard wrote to Margaret now and then, short notes about how the kids were doing, each one stripped of anything personal. She replied once a month. Her letters came in plain envelopes stamped with an institutional mark, and Richard tucked every one of them into a drawer in his study. He told himself the same story every time, that he was saving them for when the kids were older, when the truth might land with less force. But the months slipped by, then the years, and he never found the right moment to say that the illness he had described never existed. The lie could have gone on even longer if not for what happened in 1987. By then, Jennifer Coleman was a freshman at the University of Virginia, and she had started noticing problems in the timeline she'd grown up hearing. Her mother had supposedly gotten sick in early 1981. It was now 1987. 6 years was far too long to be in treatment for cancer without getting better or getting worse. And Jennifer, who had chosen biology partly to understand what had happened to her mother, realized that nothing she was learning matched the story her father had given her. On April 22, 1987, she called Richard from her dorm room. Phone records confirmed this later during a family therapy session. She asked him straight out when their mother had actually died, because that was the only thing that fit the facts. She figured Margaret must have passed away years earlier, and Richard just couldn't bring himself to say it.
Richard said later that hearing his daughter reach that conclusion, calmly, logically, made something shift in him. He knew the lie had nowhere left to go, so he told her everything. He told her about the arrest, the espionage charges, the 25-year federal sentence. He told her that Margaret was alive, in a prison in Georgia, and had been there for 6 years. Jennifer didn't say anything at first. He said the silence lasted minutes, long enough for him to realize how deeply he had changed the course of her life. When she finally spoke, all she said was, "I need to think about this." Then she hung up. She called Michael 3 days later. Michael was 17, finishing his last year of high school, and later he would say that when he learned his whole childhood had rested on a lie, all he felt was a cold, steady rage. He wanted every detail. He asked for dates, papers, anything that showed what had really happened. He needed to know what his mother had done, why his father had kept quiet for so long, and how many people around them had helped keep the truth buried. He went to Richard face to face. Neighbors later said the shouting was so loud it carried through the walls and into the hallway, and that it sounded like neither of them held back. Sarah was 14 when Jennifer and Michael told her. They sat her down and tried to explain, but all she did was cry in a low, exhausted way for about 2 hours.
After that, she stopped talking to Richard except when she had to ask something simple about chores or dinner. Anything more than that, she avoided. From there, things inside the family slid into what Dr. Patricia Morrison, a therapist who started seeing the Coleman family in 1988, called a clean example of trust breaking down in slow motion. Jennifer came home from college only when she had no choice, and even then she kept a careful distance from Richard. Michael refused to speak to his father at all for 11 months and used short written notes to handle schedules and basic tasks. Sarah began to show what Morrison described as complex grief. She was mourning the mother she had lost years earlier, but she was also grieving the father she now felt she had never known in any real way. All three children circled the same question again and again. Why had Richard lied? Why did he assume they were too fragile to hear the truth? Why did he decide they shouldn't know who their mother actually was or have the chance to decide for themselves how to deal with her choices? And why had he taken that choice from them for 6 full years? Richard's explanations, collected in therapy notes, kept returning to one point. He said he had been trying to protect them. He didn't want them labeled as the children of a Soviet spy. He didn't want them judged by classmates or neighbors. He thought it would spare them social fallout and help them keep a softer memory of their mother, one centered on her love instead of her betrayal.
He believed, honestly, that the truth would wound them more than the lie ever could. But over time, as the sessions went on, it became clear that the lie had carved its own kind of harm. The children had not only lost their mother, they had also lost the ability to trust what their father said about the world. They had built their earliest years on a story that was never real, and discovering that left a deeper mark than anyone expected. They had been grieving someone who never truly existed, and facing that false foundation cut deeper than the shock of Margaret's espionage might have if they had known it from the start. In June 1995, Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah drove to a federal correctional facility and saw their mother for the first time since the truth came out. Margaret was 62, 14 years into her sentence. The visit log noted that they stayed for 4 hours, the longest block the prison allowed for family meetings. What they talked about in those 4 hours comes mostly from what the children later chose to share, each of them offering pieces of a conversation that had waited years to happen. Prison visits were never logged unless investigators had given special approval, so nothing formal existed to show how those early meetings unfolded. Margaret did her best to lay out how everything had started. She told them about Elena Rostover, the woman she had met at a piano teachers' conference in 1974, who had eased her way into Margaret's life with patience and charm, then slowly pushed her into situations that left her exposed and scared. Over time, Margaret felt so trapped that she no longer saw a safe way out. She said she had tried more than once to quit, but each attempt brought direct threats against her family, and she had believed those threats. After that first conversation in prison, the 3 Coleman children began showing up often. Michael made the long drive from North Carolina, where he had taken an engineering job. Jennifer came down from Washington, D.C., where she had started working in public policy. Sarah visited during breaks from her graduate program in Virginia, where she was studying clinical psychology. Together, they managed to form something that passed for a relationship with their mother. It happened in short 30-minute stretches across a prison table, nothing like what they might have built if their lives had not been torn apart decades earlier. Richard Coleman never once came to see Margaret behind bars. She sent him short letters now and then, thanking him for raising their children, admitting the impossible position her actions had created for him. He saved every note but never replied. Later he said that he had done what he believed was necessary to keep the children safe. And even though he understood that the secret he held on to had caused its own kind of damage, he could not regret the decision he had made in 1981.
Margaret Coleman left federal prison on November 8, 2006, after serving more than 22 years. Her sentence shortened because of good behavior and her cooperation during counterintelligence debriefings. She settled into a small apartment in Atlanta, took a job as a clerk in a music store, and started the hard work of creating a life again as a 63-year-old woman who'd last tasted freedom in 1981. Richard Coleman died on June 15, 2010, at the age of 73 after suffering a heart attack while tending his garden. When Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah sorted through his things, they discovered a locked drawer in his study. Inside were roughly 200 letters from Margaret, all of them kept but never shown to the children. As they read through the stack, they found updates about her daily life in prison, thoughts about the choices she had made, open admissions of regret, and gentle questions about how her children were living. The story of Richard and Margaret Coleman is not neat or moralistic. It shows how people make difficult calculations when the choices in front of them all carry some form of loss. It shows how love and fear can push a person toward the very same act. And it shows how those acts send consequences into the future, touching people who had no part in the original moment. Richard Coleman handed his wife over to the FBI because he believed it was the only way to protect the children they shared. He kept that story from his kids for 6 years, telling himself it was on him to carry the weight. He thought he was doing the right thing, even when it ate at him. And the strange part is how the same decision can look honest from one side and dishonest from another. What felt like him trying to protect everyone also meant he was hiding the truth from the people he cared about most. So his choice ended up sitting in that messy space where loyalty and deception mix, depending on how you look at it.